Welcome to Kembali 2020, a Rebuild Bali festival, a digital program designed to inspire, excite, reconnect, and revitalize the Balinese and Indonesian community from 29 October to 8 November. Kembali, the Indonesian word for return or come back, represents revitalization in the face of global challenges. The festival will unite people in Bali and Indonesia together with an international audience at a time when travel is largely impossible and creating connections is more important than ever before. Today, you're joining us at a very special discussion called When the World Stopped Traveling, which is very apt to the actual motivations behind Kembali 2020. And we have with us a league of legends when it comes to Bali tourism. They have been part of the Bali tourism industry from its beginnings. We have three very special speakers with us today, and together we're going to talk about lessons from the past and also what we can do for Bali's travel and tourism industry after COVID-19. So, quick introduction to who we have with us today. We have Janice Manchika, a New Zealander who met a Balinese dancer in her hometown when he performed the Kebiar Duduk dance. After marrying, they moved to Bali together in 1964. 5 years later, they started Jan's Tours, which continued for a total of 50 years in the business. In that time, Jan was the co-founder of the Bali International Women's Association, later worked closely with the charitable organization Puspa di Bali. She's also the author of the book Bali, 1964 to 2009, The Shadows That Dance In and Out of My Memory, which tells the incredible stories Jan experienced in her many years on the island. We also have Warwick Purser, Australian who founded Pacto in 1969, which grew to become Indonesia's largest tour and travel organization. He became a consultant to the UN in developing the master plan for Bali's tourism. In 1995, he founded Out of Asia, one of Indonesia's largest exporters of handcrafted products, supplying for the likes of Habitat, Harrods, Target, Body Shop, and more. 2005, he published a book, Made in Indonesia, a tribute to Indonesia's craftspeople. In 2007, he was awarded Indonesian citizenship by presidential decree, officially making him a WNI, or Warga Negara Indonesia. He has received many awards for tourism and culture in Indonesia, is currently Chairman Friends of Borobudur, owner of Dioma Resort, and Equatorial Design. Last but not least, we have with us Stanley Joseph Allison, a veteran in the hotel industry, developing hotels in the likes of Uganda, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, before moving to Singapore to develop the Cockpit Hotel in 1966. In 1970, he was approached by KLM and Garuda Indonesia to start up their hotel division. Many will know of PT Aerowisata, the Indonesian state-owned travel company dealing in hotels, travel, transportation, and more. He built Bali's first hotel project, Hotel Bali Beach, now the Grand Ina Bali Beach in Sanur, then helped to build the Bali Tourism Development Corporation complex, or BTD complex, in Nusa Dua, where he set up the Nusa Dua Beach Hotel and the Nusa Indah Hotel Bali, which is now the Westin. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in this very special panel for Kembali 2020. As you know, our discussion today is when the world stopped traveling and how the global halt in travel has impacted on the island's future and how lessons from the past can be used to tackle the current climate. And we're going to focus on the lessons from the past because you are all legends in and the veterans of Bali's tourism industry, and you were here before it even began. You were part of the beginning. So I think let's talk about what it was like back in the day when you first arrived, and tell people and share with people what it was that brought you here and what it was like, what Bali was like and how different it is to what it is today. So let's start with Jan. Jan, you arrived in 1964. What was Bali like back then? And was tourism even really in the discussion when you arrived?
Well, I think we need to remember that in 1964, the country was still a very new republic, and a new independent republic. It was only 19 years since independence from the Dutch colonialists was decreed, and actually only 15 years since the guerrilla fighting had ceased. It was still very, very, very undeveloped. Plus, it was in the midst of the Ganjang Malaysia, or the Crush Malaysia campaign. So there was huge negative vibes about towards the US, UK, any British country, and New Zealand, of course, was or still is part of the British Commonwealth. So, in fact, when I arrived, the airport was very tiny. It was just a few sheds. So you could not come direct. You had to go via Jakarta. And there was my husband, my 13-month-old son, and myself, arriving pretty exhausted after a flight from New Zealand to be greeted at bayonet point. We were considered suspect because I was from a colonialist, capitalist, neo-colonialist country. My husband had studied there, and there was a degree of suspicion, I think you might say. It was, I tell you what, it was a very scary introduction to my new country. Once we did get to Bali on a very, very tiny little aircraft, in those days, only domestic flights from Jakarta came to Bali, and they were very few and far between, and very likely to be commandeered by a general to fly off to Kalimantan during those days. So you would get to the airport, you really had no idea whether the flight would go or not. When I did arrive, of course, Bali was extremely different from today. The general population, the wider population, was actually still uneducated. In fact, it was only my husband's generation who had education, because during the Dutch time, only very selected people were permitted, very selective Indonesians were permitted education. So, for example, my mother-in-law's generation simply were not educated. They were totally illiterate, and there was a huge literacy campaign going on. But there was also a certain underlying feeling with this Ganjang Malaysia. Initially, when I arrived, everybody was very smiley and happy outwardly. And I lived in the Puri, which is a palace of the high caste people, of my husband's family. We were pretty sheltered there. My sisters and brother-in-laws were all educated and were actually all teachers. So I was amongst people who were reasonably well educated. They did not speak English, but they did speak a little Dutch. And it wasn't until we actually moved onto the university complex, where my husband was recruited to teach agriculture and animal husbandry, that we came in touch really with academics. But even then, I never actually heard anyone discussing the possibility of tourism. 1964, you could start to feel some sort of underlying tensions. By 1965, the tensions were growing. It appeared that the Communist Party was very strong, and suddenly we were very put in quite a frightening position. People were afraid to talk with us because the communists might think that they were pro-capitalist, imperialist, and neo-colonialist, and all the other things. It got to the stage where the tensions became so high, you knew something had to happen, but you didn't know what. It was very difficult to go from island to island. Even to get back to Jakarta would have been pretty impossible. Up till that time, basically, the people who had been seen, the white people had been seen, were mostly Dutch. And a white person was called a londo from the term, from the word landa, which is the term for Dutch people. We became quite hungry. There was no private business. People were agrarians. You lived off the land. Fortunately, there was not a lot of development. People had not yet started to sell their properties for tourism development. So most people could return to the land. However, there were a lot of people who were far too poor to have any land, and they were living from hand to mouth. As for us, with the Ganjang Malaysia and all the other things that were happening in between, my husband's salary didn't arrive from Jakarta. The lecturers were all in the same boat, and we were actually quite hungry. So I tell people now, I actually know what it was like to be truly hungry. I even had to resort to eating dragonflies, and I can tell you it takes quite a few thousand dragonflies to appease your hunger. I was also pregnant at the time with my second child and very concerned about whether the child would survive without any decent food. There were very few shops. Shopping was via the markets, but of course the markets all closed down, especially when on the 30th of September, the catastrophic supposed PKI attempted coup, or aborted coup they called it, occurred. After that, life became more and more difficult. We didn't go out for months out of the house because you were afraid of what you might see. So when you ask me, were people looking towards tourism, what were their desires at that time? I think we were all, everybody was far too focused on A, survival food-wise, whether you could eat today, whether you could feed your children tomorrow, and B, whether this slaughter was ever going to end. So it wasn't ever a subject I heard discussed. In fact, I myself had not even thought of it. However, the Hotel Bali Beach was under construction, and I was involved in preparing some of the English classes. My husband was involved with Ibu Budong Bagusoto, a very prominent Balinese lady, in teaching it. So somewhere along the line, the master plan, and Warwick would be able to tell you more about that. Or was it Stanley? I think it was Stanley who was involved in that, yeah? There must have been a master plan from the general government that tourism was on the books, but to take it, to look at the general public, I find it quite difficult to think that any one of them ever did actually think in terms of tourism.
Great, thank you.
That was rather long-winded.
No, that was great. That's a great introduction. Very interesting indeed. I mean, just talking about that survival, I would say that a lot of people today in Bali are feeling that same sort of sense of
exactly
that fight for survival and that hunger, because a lot of people losing their jobs, and tourism is really not able to help them at the moment. So I think it's a great parallel, and thank you for bringing that up. That's 1964 and 1965. Warwick.
And through 1966 as well.
Yes, throughout a period just before 1969, where Warwick, you started Pacto, and Jan, you actually started your travel company as well. Warwick, why did you start Pacto in 1969, and what had changed in those 4 or 5 years where tourism was not conducive, that you felt, you know, this is the time to start travel into the island?
Okay, so I arrived on my honeymoon for a week, and the week became 2 weeks, became 3 weeks, became 4 weeks, became 5 weeks. I had a job waiting for me in London, which I eventually resigned from, having made a decision to stay on Bali. I employed the services of, at that stage, Bali's most senior guide, who, Janice, you and Stanley, you probably know, Nyomanoko was his name. And he was extraordinary. He took me for 2 weeks. He took me around Bali and shared all sorts of incredible experiences. You know, really just the most amazing introduction to Bali and its culture. And I thought, well, I would love to see my friends, who at that stage were busily making plans to come to Bali because my wife and I were here. I want to see whether I want to try and ensure that they got the same sort of experience. So I employed some young university graduates. I made sure that, of course, they had to speak great English, and I insisted they wore their local traditional clothing as uniforms. In fact, I'm pleased to say that PACTA still wears the same uniform 50 years later. And then a company called Abercrombie and Kent, who had actually arranged my initial visit to Bali, they asked me would I represent them, and that's really how it all happened. That was the era of the real jet setter coming to Bali. They were coming on their private jets. You'd have Rockefellers, Rothschilds, and junior royalty all arriving, all wanting to get a very special experience. Because they were, can I use the word, well heeled, they wanted special dance performances, they wanted special dinners in the Puris, and they actually went back and put Bali on the tourism map. And having spent really thousands of dollars when they were visiting Bali. That era is sadly gone. I mean, I saw a business opportunity. I found a man who had a company, a license for a company called Pacific Tours, which he said, yes, you can have that. I mean, we abbreviated de facto, and that little embryonic 3 guides as it started grew into de facto, which had in the end 300 staff and 7 offices throughout Indonesia. So that was, I mean, Bali was, if I can use the word, pure. It was just so pure and so fresh and untouched. There were amazing, a handful, or more than a handful, of wonderful craftspeople doing, people like Ida Tilleman Mas, who certainly Janice and Stanley would know, doing the most amazing, wonderful wood carving. It was really just an extraordinary, fresh, wonderful experience. Yeah, and I was so happy to be involved in it. So that's what happened to me from 1968. I think you maybe want to ask a bit later the master plans and UNDP involvement, but that came at the next stage. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Warwick. So just to recap a little bit on these jet setters, what were they really interested to see when coming to Bali? What was the allure back then?
If I can use everything that was non-touristy, everything that was totally not new, because the things that they were seeing, like dance performances and experiences in the Puri, were things that actually had been going on for ages, but never really exposed to tourism. So anything that was non-touristy, they absolutely loved. Yeah.
I love the parallel to today's rich jet setters. They're searching for the best table at the beach clubs with the most expensive bottles. So very different era we're in at the moment when it comes to the
all that exists. As Jan well knows, I think at that stage, I mean, we are so spoiled now. I think, Jan, in Denpasar, there was 1 or 2 little shops that sold margarine, no butter, of course, bread that had been sliced bread in packets. I mean, that was all we could get in terms of, Western delicacies. So there were no restaurants, or very, very few restaurants. That came a little bit later on.
Great. Well, I think this is a good sort of segue into a question for you, Stanley. You were approached by KLM and Garuda Indonesia and you started the state-owned company PT Aerowisata. And you started the development of the Hotel Bali Beach in Sanur, which I would say was kind of this sort of turning point into
May I interrupt?
art. Sure, of course.
The Bali Beach was built before my time. The hotel, Aerowisata's first hotel, was the Hotel Sanur Beach. That was the one I was party to building on the beach at Sanur. The Bali Beach was built long before I arrived, actually. Sorry, I hope you don't mind me.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that, Stanley. So part of the Aerowisata group, I just find it interesting that the state-owned company started in Sanur. Maybe you can talk about why Sanur was kind of the development area in that start of tourism in Bali. What was it about Sanur that they thought to focus on?
Well, thank you for that drop in. KLM Garuda were flying to Bali. There was one other airline, Pan Am and Thai International, no other airline. Garuda and KLM were instructed by the government to try and increase tourism. So that's why I was brought in to open up a company. I was in Singapore for my London company, but was recruited to join, to start up PT Aerowisata. The main reason was to provide good accommodation, high yield accommodation for the tourists in Bali. It suited the airlines because they had people in planes. At one stage, there was, I think all agree, there was such a shortage of bedrooms for hotels in Bali. We were always trying to catch up with the increase in tourism. So that's one of, and I was advised by the president of Garuda and a minister in the government that we had to aim for high yield tourism, which unfortunately is gone now. But that was done. The main problem that it was a disaster really. One night Pan Am were flying in and it hit the mountain outside Singaraja. All killed, took 3 or 4 days to get to. There was a German doctor here who actually climbed up with the rescue team. This brought to light that the airport of Bali was really a domestic airport, not international. So the two airlines, Thai and Pan Am, said, if you don't improve the airport, they came in thinking the fishermen's boats in North Bali were the runway. It wasn't. So that's what they say happened. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the airport became international. With that came every other airline in the world you could think of. That was the end, in my opinion, of keeping Bali for the high yield market. But that was the, in my opinion, the turning point of the tourists we had before came for culture. And we all knew them because we met with our clients very often. They would, as Warwick said, the wood carving, the painting, the markets, not shopping centres. The countryside, you could visit the countryside easily. Later on, the roads became so congested that people just weren't, the right people weren't coming to see the culture of Bali. That, of course, is my opinion.
Great, thank you, Stanley. And yes, you're right. I mean, I like to draw the comparison to back then, there was a shortage of bedrooms, and you're currently trying to catch up. But now now it's complete opposite. Is there's too many bedrooms that there than tourists coming in every year, especially now.
The bad thing is in my opinion, is the room rates. Let's be honest, you're in business for business. The room rates, like, there's a fight on room rates, undercutting. Luckily, I'm out of the business now, so but this undercutting on room rates, I don't know if Mr. Purcell or Warwick will agree with me. It's maybe good for the client, but not good for the hotel industry. This is why I think the hotels produced now are not them all, of course, but a lot of them are running not like hotels should be run.
Right. Thank you, Stanley. Yes, I completely agree with you. Warwick, I'll go back to you quickly because as Jan mentioned, you had worked closely with the UN for a tourism master plan for Bali. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that vision was and what was the hopes back then for what Balinese tourism would be and in the long term.
Okay, so I'm sorry, the sequence is a little bit incorrect. I was asked to join a committee set up by the World Bank to do the master plan for tourism in Bali. And the UNDP involvement came after my duration with PACTA. So the World Bank developed a master plan. They wanted to concentrate hotel development onto Nusa Dua, concentrate, but not exclusively. There was to be no inland accommodation in areas such as Ubud. No building higher than the coconut tree was one of the recommendations. But sadly, lack of government control and corruption meant that this plan was never really followed. Yeah. My involvement with UNDP, as I said, came after my tenure with PACTA. Yeah. And my first appointment was as Director General of Tourism in Vanuatu. But to my knowledge, there's been no real master plan that's been developed subsequent to what the World Bank did there in the 1970s. There's been no definition of the market that Bali should be really attracting. And the result is there's been haphazard development throughout the island, which in many cases has destroyed the environment, the landscape. Bali has become famous as an environmental disaster, lack of rubbish control. Very seriously, the water levels are now at a dangerous level, soon to run out. Yeah? My great hope that the one great thing that could be positive that comes out of this era of COVID that we're going through now, is that an independent committee can be formed to do a new master plan for Bali, and it should be. It shouldn't have local people because there's going to be all sorts of vested interests involved. Get a group outside of experts to do a new master plan to really look at the way the history of Bali tourism up until this point. Yeah, I can say not much good can come out of the situation we're in at the moment. This is the one good thing that actually could come out, and I really just hope that it does. Yeah. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Warwick. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If anything, I think a lot of people were saying the start of this year was already it was obvious we were going beyond carrying capacity, and it took a pandemic for people to actually stop in their tracks. Everyone knew it was happening, but nobody was doing anything about it because the money was coming in. So why change something where everyone's benefiting from, even though the island itself is not benefiting? So agreed, the pandemic has forced everyone to rethink tourism on the island?
Well, we hope so. We hope so. I mean, it has forced people to think. That would be my prayer, Eddie. But has it? That's the question we've got to ask. Has it really?
Well,
I hope so.
yeah, it's been 6 months and there's not really been much of a plan set out
No.
for the future. So that is a little bit worrying, considering we've had a lot of time to think about it. I'd
Yep.
like to go back to you, Jan, to think about the changes of attitudes from the tourists over the years. If in the early 70s you had those jet setters and the people coming from culture, and then you could say maybe early 90s things changed and people were just coming for the beach, the bintangs, and the parties. Where did it really change? And being in the business for so long, where did it what was it really that changed that mindset of the traveler coming to Bali, from your experience in the business?
I think actually the mindsets of tourists are very dependent on the market sector. For example, when we first started, which was, as you know, 1969, we actually had rather an odd start, like similar to what Warwick was saying. We tried to start up with very little capital. We borrowed money for a telephone and a signboard from some missionaries. My husband was one of the, as Warwick mentioned, there were very few people speaking English. My husband being a lecturer, he managed to also rake up a couple of other lecturers whom we used as tour guides. But to get ourselves known, we didn't have the money for promotions. One day we happened to be celebrating my son's 3rd birthday. We were still finding things very difficult food-wise because we had started with very little. So we went to Summer Beach and we were buying satay on the beach. There we met a couple of nuns. They were from the St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, I think it was. And my husband helped to translate for them, and the next thing they used him as a tour guide for the next few days. Up until that time, as we didn't own vehicles, we used to walk down to the middle of town and hitch a ride with the one tour operator who was the original tour operator at Government One. We used to hitch a ride because they had drivers but no English speakers. So he used those cars, showed them around. They went back to Australia, told their tour wholesaler there that here was a man and his wife who spoke English, and they had a few guides who spoke English, but not many others did. So they came to see us. At the time, we had initially brought a second-hand refrigerator from New Zealand, so we had no electricity to use it. So we had swapped it for a piece of land on which we were trying to build an office. And these people said, okay, we'll loan you money, build the office, and each time you send us an invoice, we will take so much off the debt. Right? So initially, our start was with Australians. And at that time, because Bali was such a new destination, despite Australia's close location to Indonesia, it was still a very new destination for most Australians, apart from the odd surfers. So they would come in tour groups, and the tour groups would have a tour leader. At that stage, they wanted a comfortable hotel, good safe meals, because remember in those days, everybody got Bali belly. I don't think there were bottled water already. Do you remember, Warwick? I can't remember, but I do remember that everybody was afraid of the Bali belly. So as the
all boiled.
Sorry?
So all the water had to be boiled,
yeah. I'm not sure whether there was already bottled water on sale, but the Australians that we handled would stay in the Hotel Bali Beach because they'd be a large group and they would be fully escorted. They wanted to go out by day but come back and have their safe meals. They were afraid to eat out and you had to do their box lunches. That was initially. Actually, that was great when we had the tour leaders because, as Warwick told you, there was very little Western food available, and they would often bring us a leg of lamb and sometimes a bottle of cream. once Qantas got flying, they used to also bring it in for us, which was great. So that was how the Australians started, and that was for some years. We basically, handling Australians, only had the groups. The Europeans were quite different. They came in, they were not looking for a comfortable accommodation. They were more adventurous, I guess, with food. They didn't seem to worry about Bali belly. Probably they got it, probably some didn't. But they were much more into the culture. They wanted experience, they wanted to see the ceremonies, they wanted to meet the people. So they were great to take around because, as Warwick said, and as you know yourself, there's so much fascination in this island. It was good to have them. Then our Americans, like Warwick said, were the jet set at that stage. Seldom had the lower bracket income of Americans. And I think that's how I first met Warwick, because you were at the Tanjung Sari at that stage, yeah? I don't remember what year that was.
That was
So they stayed at the Tanjung Sari, which was the boutique place and still is a great hotel. They wanted luxury, they wanted boutique, they wanted fine dining, which was very difficult to find anywhere else. They wanted the best vehicles. That was also quite difficult in those days. Especially, we couldn't even get shock absorbers, could we? Warwick, do you remember when we couldn't buy shock absorbers? You had to go to Jakarta to get your shock absorbers, or you could like in the car. The roads were all potholes, what roads there were. And of course, they liked to buy good quality souvenirs from people like Gustilum, whom Warwick mentioned. I think that went on so far as the Europeans. They have continued very much to be much more adventurous. I found with our Americans, they still like to have their luxury, but they perhaps were more keen in adventuring out than they used to be. And it took some years, not too long, I think, before the tour groups coming from Australia started to change. We started to get individuals, then we started to get families. Initially, they would stay in Sanur because Sanur was deemed to be a good, safe place to stay. I think places like, well, there was the Bali Beach Hotel, but places like Tanjung Sari and I think the Sindhu Beach Hotel were quite well known, and so that's where they would stay. Then it must have been, I think even in the late 70s and early 80s, the surfers were coming. They started staying over in Kuta. So yeah, I don't know whether I've got off the track from your question. I can't actually say what years things changed. I think it was a gradual progression to suddenly now we're having, well, we were prior to COVID, having almost a little Oka City over in on what we call the dark side, Kuta, Legian, Seminyak, Canggu, etc. So there definitely has been a lot of changes to be seen. Also, I noticed towards probably the last 10 years or so, we started to get Scandinavian and European student groups coming through. Okay, they would come in groups, but they were students and they would spend hours doing research while they were here. Towards perhaps the last, probably since the bombs in 2002 and 2005, there was a trend also for people to come and volunteer with the various foundations here, and people, especially from the closer countries like Australia and New Zealand, they would have come here several times, made friends with Balinese families, want to come and help them. And so it seemed to be a much bigger mix. You still also have the luxury clients, but you also have the, what are they called? What some people would call the obo slobos. People, I think, in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, became much more interested in adventure as well. They like the trekking and the hiking and things that I didn't really see that they wanted previously to that. I'm sorry if that, does that answer your question?
Thank you, Jan. Yes, no, that's great. I mean, I just wanted to see sort of how things developed and where things were changing from. So that answered the question. Thank you. Stanley, I think I'll move to you, and we will be discussing sort of recovery from COVID, because that's really what the objective of this whole thing is. But we're just trying to learn a little bit from the past and understand the development of tourism before we can think about where we should go from here. So, Stanley, considering you were working with a government state-owned enterprise, when Kuta and Legian started to develop, what did the government think of that? Because it wasn't really in the plan for sort of contained tourism of Sanur and Nusa Dua. Where did things go wrong, and how did things go wrong, and why didn't the government do anything to control that? Because I think those areas really changed the way in which people came to Bali and why.
Well, you're so correct. The government of the day then were never really giving guidelines on that one would stop. I mean, the authorities in Bali are the people that should have said Kuta and Legia and these places, all right for the server, but control the building on those areas, so that at the moment, up to recently, it's a hotspot of any old thing, clubs, nightclubs, that all going mad, and it just comes back to there was no. This is why we must have a master plan that's approved by the government to keep the island from slipping back to these hotspots of accommodation. Kuta and Legian is quite nice, but Kuta and around there. And I tell you another thing, the massive development of villas. Very nice if it's for a villa for people to live in, but actually the villas turned into hotels. You could rent a villa for 3 bedrooms for the room, one room in a hotel. It through the hotel industry, I quite a right business, but there seems to be, there's supposed to be the villas that came up, that were built, were supposed to be for people living, not rent out. So it's thrown the whole, to me, it's thrown the whole thing out of balance at the moment. And they're very strict. When we built the Nusa Dua Beach Hotel and the Nusa Indah Hotel, which is now the Westin, we had strict lines from the World Bank, IDB Bank, all these people, that this must go that way. And it worked beautifully. Nusa Dua wasn't built to keep the people in, away from the Balinese people. It was built so that the Balinese culture, as Warwick was saying, would not be disturbed by mass hotel development, which is happening now. Nusa Dua was, to me, I was involved very much so with the team that were developing the Nusa Dua area. We had to follow, we had Balinese people involved on design, layout, everything. So it kept the culture, the gardens were beautiful. It was an ideal setup, but you go to Kuta and Legian and around some of the areas, it's a big mess. That's my thought on that.
Great, thank you, Stanley. I think a lot of people get confused because if they see the Nusa Dua hotel complex, they think, oh, this is sort of, you could perceive it as being sort of elitism. You only come in, it's kind of like a gated community. But really, that
No.
wasn't the initial
That was
motivation.
never actually one of the ministers, Yobabi, he was dead against that theory. He made us, we had to keep the paths open between the hotels so that the people from the village could walk down to the beach. That was by law, we had to have that access to the beach for the Balinese people of the area. We didn't need to disturb any fishing village, no village, because it was a pristine beach, which the World Bank, and ADB Bank, and the government thought was the ideal place to do it. So it was never envisaged that way, that it should become a enclave for the rich and famous. But not at all.
Well, thank you. Yes, Yupave is also a very legendary name when it comes to tourism. And I think
He was the father of tourism for Indonesia.
And had a very, very strong positive vision for it, which I don't know if the other, yeah, I don't know if any other minister of tourism.
As Warwick was saying, and we've discussed this together, a master plan has to be produced, but it's no good having a local master plan, because I was on one committee and I gave up after 3 meetings because this was to solve the traffic problem in Ubud, so it nearly sent me crazy. But everyone said, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, do this, oh no, that will affect my business. I said to them, look, in Sydney, Melbourne, and many cities, you have a pedestrian malls. They were booming. But to turn Ubud High Street into a pedestrian mall, you think I was going to destroy Ubud. So you need, as our Warwick and I have said, a team of people that will assess the potential, the development, the planning, but it must be strictly adhered to. When we opened when Nusa Dua was opened, the World Bank and ADB had strict lines, roads coming into the host from the crossroads in. The land beside had to be kept clear so many meters back. Within days and months, the whole of that land was occupied by shops. And the World Bank complained, I know I was there when they complained, but they said it was too late, now it's done.
Yes, well, I think we've established now sort of what.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you, Stanley. What we've established now, sort of what people originally came for, and how that's changed, and how tourism just mushroomed and mushroomed and mushroomed into these new areas. And I think, yeah,
we're all for tourism, but as you say, control.
Well, I think the first lesson that Bali really received was the first Bali bombing, and then the second Bali bombing. So I think this is a good this is a lesson from the past as well about recovery. We had a booming, sorry, I shouldn't really use that word. We had a really good tourism industry pre-Bali bombing, and everyone was so happy. And then the bombs happened, and everything came crashing down. The whole economy of Bali came crashing down. So it took a long time for things to recover again. And I'd like to ask all of you, what were the main drivers for the recovery after the Bali bombs? Maybe Warwick, maybe you can start with this, because we're kind of in that same situation, but to a different degree now. So what are the main drivers of recovery that people focused on after the Bali bomb?
Eddie, I think Janice is more, it's a better person to ask that question too. I, at that stage, after Bali, was spending a lot of my time in Yogyakarta. But so I was really an onlooker from the side. I think Janice would probably be a better person to direct that question too, yeah?
Sure. Okay, Janice?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say really what the driver was. I can speak from personally from my own company, Jan's Tours. After 2002, virtually everything was dead. Yeah, you really could not say there were any tourists coming. There were still a lot of people that we had to get out. There was a huge, it took us weeks to find out whether all our clients were actually safe or not, because some just got themselves to the airport and fled without letting us know, and others moved to hotels without letting us know. The only people who were actually coming in were volunteers. Personally, we were able to stay afloat. I think I'm really grateful for the fact that we have always kept an emergency account for such things. We learned a little bit too after things like the Gulf War and MERS and SARS and swine flu and bird flu, etc. But nothing, of course, could have prepared us for 2002. We personally were able to keep afloat by putting our staff on. We didn't lay anybody off after 2002, but we put people onto 4-day weeks instead of 5, which meant we could save 1 day's not pay. We still continued to pay them, but we saved 1 day's meal and transport allowance, which wasn't much. Then it got a bit worse, so we had to start putting them on 3-day weeks. We got through that. We still had a little bit left in our emergency account, emergency fund, or whatever you like to call it. And during the time, of course, during the whole time, we kept in constant touch, updating our suppliers from overseas, letting them know exactly what was going on. I think a lot of them realized that it was actually only in a certain area that the bombs were, but always afraid that it could happen elsewhere. The clients that we did have, we quickly managed to get out. By 2005, I think maybe 2004, things were looking up. And you mentioned booming. It was almost like a new boom. We thought everything was going to be fine. People were back on full time. Tourists were coming, hotels were fuller, restaurants were fuller. People who'd been laid off at certain places were being taken back on. I think a lot of the hotels actually laid off all their daily workers, and then rumakan, how do you say that in English? I'm not sure. Asked their staff to stay at home. Probably just kept on the odd staff to come in and do their cleaning and maintenance. But by 2005, we thought everything was a little bit hunky-dory. We hadn't yet been able to replenish our emergency fund, but things were on the up and up, and then suddenly 2005 hit. Personally, and I think it might, island-wide, it had a more disastrous effect on Bali than the 2002, because people who thought this was a one-off, and Bali lovers who still wanted to come back and support Bali had started to come back, but suddenly they realized it wasn't just a one-off, it can happen again. So that was really the toughest time. For us, by this time, we had to put people on 3-day weeks, saving the 3 days meal and transport money. Then we had to start taking 5% off their salaries, and eventually we needed to lay off quite a few. Later, we did take a couple back on, but we never took the same number back on. We decided to try and downsize and be a little bit more efficient with staffing.
If I can open up.
I know a lot of, I think, sorry.
Sorry, Jen, just want to open up the discussion as well to everyone. We're talking about,
If I could add something, Eddie, when you've a minute, I'd like to add something.
of course, yeah.
Ready?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I mean, I said I wasn't involved because I wasn't directly involved, but I was on the sidelines as well. I mean, I think the big difference now with COVID is that the uncertainty of it all.
Yeah.
Nothing that's happened in previous years has surpassed the effect that COVID is now making in Bali. Yeah? And we can all sit back and make predictions about how Bali tourism should be in the future, but it's really totally out of our hands in a way. I mean, what is the airline policy going to be about
Exactly.
bringing people into Bali? Is it going to be aiming at filling the aircraft with cheaper fares, or is it going to try and recover losses by making travel more expensive? I
And
mean,
even if the
those
countries will allow it.
absolutely, and that's not going to happen immediately anyway. But I think Janice and Stanley, you'd agree that nothing Bali has experienced is having has the same effect as we are having now with COVID, and it's this big question of the uncertainty of it all. Yeah,
Yeah.
we can sit about talking about master plans and tourism plans and all that, but to a great extent, it really is out of our hands. Yeah. Eddie, do you intend later talking about what can Bali do to reduce its dependency on tourism? Is that going to be one of your questions later on, or what?
Well, I'd actually like to bring that up now because
Well,
I think it's part of the recovery is we're too dependent on one industry. We don't know what's going to happen. So
right.
should we reduce the dependency on it now? Should we stop thinking about tourism as the savior?
So what are the alternatives? Yeah. I mean, there's been such a huge investment in tourism development. You know, I could say sadly at a certain level, which is not producing the tourism dollars, if I can say, that we would like. It's cheap tourism with people not spending a great deal of money here. I think the question was raised whether art and craft could be developed to not to some in some degree replace this dependency on tourism. But in fact, tourism, art and craft, to some extent at least, is very much dependent on the tourist market to buy it. But having said all that, I think there is an opportunity to try and promote the whole creative industry and to some extent headquarter it here. There are some famous international names such as John Hardy Jewelry, the Biasa Clothing Manufacturing Company, that are already employing hundreds up to thousands of people. And the government should give incentives to develop more like these so that Bali becomes Indonesia's hub for creative development and export. And that at least the Balinese have got this incredible talent of being able to make almost anything with their hands. In fact, so do the Javanese, but the Balinese are exceptional here. And, you know, I'm sure there is an untapped market for trying to develop more of the creativity here that can be commercialized and provide, you know, lots of job opportunities, especially when it comes to doing in volume for export. That's just an off-the-cuff thought, yeah.
May I just intervene? I think it's right. It would. I'm not for bringing in experts all the time, but some people should maybe, as the big business people, should come in to do an assessment. Perhaps with the Balinese are great on their hands and very good workers and this and that. Maybe you could start up some light industries that could be brought into the hub of the hotel business. Nowadays, we import quite a lot of items from China, and other places. Could this not be brought into line in Bali? I go to Bintang and buy things from that made in China, which I think paper bags and that could easily be made here. And these are just silly things, but they could start making. Why should I pay 9,000 rupees for a paper bag made in China? So if perhaps they could bring in a few people to assess what could be done, then the government should start it off by giving them tax. As we were in the hotel industry for the first 2 years, we were given tax concessions. So that helped us to open up. So, and perhaps if you brought in some business people relevant to what we were looking for, it could start up a second business, which could then translate into the hotel business.
Great suggestion. Thank you, Stanley. Jan, do you have anything to add to this sort of moving out of
I couldn't actually I couldn't actually hear Stanley, so hopefully I'm not repeating.
Sorry.
It's okay. This probably is not really tourism, but I think that when I first came, it was definitely an island based on agraria, and I think now people are going back to growing hydroponic vegetables and all sorts of other vegetables. When you look in the supermarkets, what do you see? You see imported fruits. What are people using for their offerings, or what were they using for their offerings for the temples prior to COVID? Imported apples, imported pineapples, imported papaya, imported fruits, which now the local fruit, okay, the local fruits were still, a lot of them were going to the hotels and to the restaurants and to the local people who couldn't afford the imported ones. I think there needs to be money also spent for the agricultural and fruit and vegetable industry, and Bali should look at being able to export some of those tropical fruits, which we grow, but then we think it's better to have the imported ones. I know that that's not really related with tourism, but I think that it's one thing that the government needs to look at. And as Warwick said, the handicraft sector, including also exports. We've been exporting a lot of people, a lot of workers to overseas on the cruise ships, etc. It remains to be seen whether they will still have jobs as well.
No, that's a very good point. And no, I think it's good to actually discuss the ideas of outside tourism. So Warwick talked about the creative economy and crafts, and Stanley was talking about production and moving a lot of the production that we depend on from overseas into Bali to support the local industry, but also supply the local industry as well. And then you're mentioning to support and develop the agriculture, the local agriculture. So it's really creating this things that are made in Bali economy and understanding that can take off the dependency on tourism, at least. And even if tourism goes back up, I think the hope would be we're not all standing on one leg anymore. We've kind of spread it out into 3 or 4 legs, so that if there is a future situation, we're not going to be all thrown into the same boiling pot. So I think those are great suggestions there. Maybe going back to tourism a little bit, I think we'll have maybe 5 minutes. Stanley, maybe once tourism is open or before it opens, what are some things that Bali needs to fix before it opens again?
I hope you've got a lot of time.
What are the main things you think
I think
should be addressed first?
I think one of the main things is transportation on the island of Bali. In the at the end of the normal period, that's at virus struck. To go out on the roads of Bali was a nightmare. I'm sure we've all known that. To go anywhere, I was at home in UK, and my sister said, all these, my friends, have just been to Bali. I come and have dinner, we told her. I said, would you go back? Oh, no. I said, no, fine. We liked it, but we're not going back. Well, every tour we did, we set off all right, but we might not get home till 8 or 9 o'clock. We were supposed to be back at 5. The roads were full, isn't it? I think that would be one of the main things. And to me, that would be the main problem to be solved. And we wouldn't be popular saying this, but I think a moratorium should be placed on building hotels for a period, especially after the return to some form of normality. It will never be the same again, I don't think. But the hotels and the tourist trade will have to catch up on years of, how long is it going to be? 2 years like this in Bali? They've got to catch up. No one's got any money. The hotels are closing because they're trying to sell 48 hotels at the moment in Bali. That's the ones known. So I think the industry must be given some tax breaks or something like that to start the ball rolling.
Great, thank you, Stanley. Well, I think the irony right now is about the getting around the islands that
it's too easy.
Well, yeah, it's too easy. Now is the perfect time to get around and look at things.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so it's a great time.
I think Jan would agree with me there. Can you hear me, Jan? No. I think that is one of the big problems because transportation is so important. Free and easy. And driving, instead of driving nose to tail or tail to tail, you can see the countryside. We all know that.
Thanks, Stanley. Let's I'll go to either Warwick or Jan if you both have some opinions on this. But once tourism's open again properly, what do you think Bali's message should be? How should we attract people again? Because right now the focus on hotels is sort of being clinical. It's all talking about, hey, we clean up, hey, we're really hygienic, and that's the focus. But is that really going to attract people back to the island?
It's only one. Jan, would you like to speak, or shall I, or what?
No, you go first.
Okay, so the safety message is obviously an important one for the hotels to be able to promote. But even before that, we've got to get some things going quickly that are all concerned with the protection of the environment. Yeah. And Bali's got a terrible reputation now for its rubbishy beaches, for the rivers that are filled with trash, and we've got this impending great problem with the water levels drastically reduced. I mean, those are the issues that now must quickly be looked at, addressed, and acted upon, so that you know, okay, we're starting a new chapter in our tourism development, and these are the things that we have looked at. Yeah, come to a safe Bali, come to a clean Bali. Focus on that. Yeah, I mean, Jan, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I was going to say the same thing, garbage management, etc., but also security, because there is a lot of crime happening, and it's especially over in your way, isn't it, Eddie? There is crime. People are tending not to come because of the traffic jams, because of the garbage, and because of the fear of crime. So as well as safety in from the point of hygiene. I think the police have got to do something more, whether the Department of Tourism, whether all the stakeholders get together and discuss this with the police, there has to be more patrolling. Unfortunately, while people can still be paid off, it's a difficult thing, but there are certain areas which obviously are, if anybody is a member of crime, what is it, Bali Crime thing on the Facebook, it seems that there is more and more happening, especially now when people have lost their jobs. We can expect more. I don't know what the answer is. I know that the Banjaras need to do their part, that the police need to do their part. And I think we need to gently be warning our clients about the do's and the don'ts of, not having their bum bags on display, and if they're riding a scooter, have things under the saddle or whatever. But it boils down to the fact that so much is happening, and whether it's, even if it's reported, whether it's ever actually followed up on. I know the police have been making quite a few arrests to do with the ATM scams, and there have been arrests after attacks in certain areas on the, I think maybe the Seminyak Jungle side. But I think there has to be a lot more, people have to have a lot more faith, A, in the fact that COVID is under control, and B, security, as well as the rubbish and the traffic jams.
That's great.
I also think that it's the time when the government needs to put a stop on further hotel development, because even during COVID, it's amazing how many buildings are still going up. And where are these people going to come from? Where is the water going to come from? Where is there going to be enough electricity? It's the people who go without the water in the end. It's the people who go without the electricity in the end. So, yeah, to me, there's a lot to be done beforehand. I also think it would be, this is not directly in relation to that question perhaps, but I also think this would be a time when maybe HPE, the Association for Guides, got together with the government, ran some more examinations and trainings for guides, because there are a lot of freelance guides out there who are giving false information, who really have no knowledge of what they're showing people. Another thing that is of concern that needs to be sorted out is the vendors, especially on the beaches. Really, really pushy, sometimes getting really nasty, making people feel quite nervous. There's, I think, as well as what Warwick said, I think the crime and the pushy vendors and so on need to be looked at, and also stopping the development of hotels,
Right.
even though it will offer jobs, but to what detriment of the island?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jen. I think that's probably all we have time for. Thank you all so much for your great input. I think it was great to be able to go down memory lane a little bit and actually add to the nostalgia of what Bali used to be. And I think that's really what should be focused on when we open up again and say, hey, before mass tourism, we had this beautiful high yield tourism. People came for the right reasons. So that's really why I wanted to get all of your insight on that. And it sounds magical. And I think a lot of people listening will say, I wish I was here back then. I wish I could have experienced Bali back then. But what you're all sharing is obviously your disappointment with Bali now, and COVID should really be a time where we develop environmental management, traffic management, security, and this new added health and hygiene, of course. And you're all saying that we need a new master plan, go back to that original idea of what Bali, of the vision of Bali, and have a vision, which we haven't had for 40 years, as you all mentioned. So actually create a master plan again and bring in experts for that. And your ideas for moving out of tourism with developing the creative economy, the crafts, developing a new production on the island, and also developing the agriculture on the island as well. Some amazing ideas, some great lessons from the past. But it sounds like whoever's listening, hopefully there's some government people listening, but hopefully they understand how much homework they have. But it also means I don't think we can depend so much on them. A lot of people, if you have the power to do some of these things mentioned in this talk, then I hope you can do them. The private industry should really do what they can first and not wait. I don't think we have the time to wait around too much, do we? I think that's probably all we have time for. So thank you all so much for joining us and sharing your insights and your knowledge and your opinions. Yeah, so thank you. And I'm sure you all get together and discuss these things anyway, so including me in your usual private discussions and sharing that with everyone listening today.
Well, thank you, Eddie.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you for all those good and interesting, deep questions. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Eddie, and nice to see you guys too, Warwick and Alice and Sam.
Yeah.
So Kembali 2020 was made possible with the support of the Yayasan Mudra Swati Saraswati Patron Program and their donors. The Patron Program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals and the foundation. By making a valuable contribution to the Yayasan Patron Program, you will be directly involved in delivering both festivals in due time. Your contribution will guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, culture, and the creative arts. Don't forget to follow Ubud Writers Festival at Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com to find out more information on the Patron program. I am Eddie Spears, and I've been very honored to be part of this fantastic panel of the veterans and legends of Bali's tourism. Thank you to Stanley Allison, Warwick Purser, and Janice Manchika. And hopefully this all brings good ideas and the recovery of Bali for the future. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.